Story 1. My daughter has been prying at the door handle every night. It's gone from adorable to disturbing. I remember the first time I heard it. Click, click. "Honey, what's that?" I asked my wife Carmen, after waking up in the middle of the night to a strange sound. "What's what?" she replied in a groggy state, frustrated that I had woken her so late. But the sound had stopped. The next night I heard it again. Click, click. What could that possibly be? I wondered, as I woke up my wife again. This time she heard it. It sounds like the doorknob. But by the time we walked over to it, the sound had stopped. Luckily for me, back when I lived in the city, I had always gotten into the habit of locking my bedroom door, and that tradition continued well into moving into my wife's apartment, and even our current home in the suburbs. The following night, we didn't hear the sound. Perhaps we were both in too deep of a sleep, or maybe it didn't happen that night, but either way, we thought the strange occurrence was behind us, until the next night when we heard it again. Click, click. "Is that what I think it is?" Carmen asked. "It most certainly is," I replied, a chill going down my spine as the recurring sound was beginning to genuinely terrifying me. This time I tiptoed over to the door, careful not to alert whoever was turning it, and opened it quickly, only to find my 8-year-old daughter, just standing there staring at me. "Christy," I asked. "Yes, Dad," she replied. "What are you doing, dear? You nearly scared me to death." "I missed you and Mommy." It was so adorable that I nearly forgot how creepy the sounds of the previous nights had been. That's all? But then she simply turned and walked away. "Good night, Daddy." I climbed back into bed and let out a sigh of relief, relieved that my daughter was the source of the sound. But the next day I started to think about it more, about the number of times it had happened, and how, after claiming to miss us, she simply walked away. So when it happened again the next night, I didn't open the door. Instead, I simply tiptoed over to it and listened. Click, click. I heard my daughter tugging at the door handle, twisting and turning it, in a clear attempt to pry it open while we were sleeping. Or at least she must have assumed. That's when the whole thing began to actually terrify me. If she was trying to open the door and get into the bedroom while my wife and I were asleep, what did she intend to do? I became obsessed with that thought, to the point where I couldn't fall back asleep that night, and hatched a plan to get to the bottom of it. So the next night, I did what any rational parent would do when their child was uncharacteristically twisting at their bedroom doorknob every night, and left the door unlocked. And so, after pretending to fall asleep, I lay in bed, waiting, passing the time on my cell phone so as to not fall asleep. Until a few hours later, when, in the middle of the night, I heard a new sound. Not that of the door handle twisting and turning back and forth. No, this time, I simply heard the sound of the door handle turning, followed by the squeaky door opening. Click. Screech. I immediately turned off my cell phone and shut my eyes, just far enough so that I could see through them, and pretended to sleep. What happened next still haunts me. Lying there in the dark, my eyes squinting, I saw the blurred shape of my daughter open the door, close it behind her, and slowly walk over to my wife's side of the bed. She must miss her mother after all. I thought to myself, giving her the benefit of the doubt, until I carefully turned my head, just slowly enough so that my daughter didn't realize I was looking, and saw my 8-year-old daughter reach behind her and remove from her pajamas a kitchen knife. She held it up above her head and swung it down towards my sleeping wife, not before I able to reach my arm out and catch the blade in my hand, letting out a large scream. "Christy, what are you doing?" But she didn't reply. She simply let out a loud hiss and seemingly slithered away out our bedroom door through the hallway and back into her bedroom, where we heard her own bedroom door slam. We locked Christy in her bedroom that night, before my wife drove me to the hospital as I relayed the night's events, my impaled hand more than enough evidence to convince her of what had happened. I would like to say that after we got back, my daughter returned to normal. The sound of the door handle stopped, and we went back to being a family living out our lives happily ever after. But when we got home early that morning, Christy had broken through her bedroom door and escaped from the house, never to be seen again. Still to this day, I wonder where my daughter might be, still locking my door each night. I can only hope that others do the same. Story 2. The old lady living next to me has no face. I recently moved into a new apartment in a quiet neighborhood somewhere in the Philippines, and I think I'm the only one that noticed something extremely wrong with the old lady living next to me. Let's call her Linda. I sometimes see her during the day, watering plants on her little porch, getting the mail, or her simply sitting outside getting some sun. From what I heard, she's a retired nurse that worked in one of the asylums from back in the day. She also lived alone for a couple of years now after her husband passed, back in the 90s. We exchanged a few friendly highs and hellos a couple of times, and everything was good for a while. One time she gave me pasta. It tasted weird. I would always hear her record player playing old songs during afternoons. Linda was around 65 years old, had graying hair and a sweet smile on her lips every time you talked to her. She had this grandmotherly vibe to her. I liked that since I lost my grandma at a very young age, but we never really became close. She was sort of distant and kept to herself. Fast forward to a couple of months since moving in, I worked late shifts and would usually come home at around 12 a.m. That's when the strange things started occurring. As I was opening the gate to my apartment, I felt like I was being watched. You know that feeling in the back of your neck and your spine just tingling out of nowhere. I glanced at Linda's house a couple of times after noticing all the lights were off. Odd. She usually left the front porch lights on through the night out of habit, but this was nothing to be alerted by. Maybe she simply forgot. But after a couple of nights like this, that feeling of being watched never left me. One night, I finally took a closer look into the darkness of her house and noticed someone sitting on her porch. Just barely visible through the darkness. It was her. I couldn't see her face clearly, but I could make out the shape of her body. Thin, hair down, hunched over on a chair, not moving. She was facing my direction, I was sure of that. I was also sure that she was the one watching me these past few nights. I waved to her. No response. I shrugged it off. Tired from work, I didn't have time and energy to stress over what my neighbors were up to. But what could she be doing outside at 12 a.m.? I didn't think of these things back then, but it was certainly odd looking back. The next morning, I saw her outside talking to another neighbor. Just the usual. At a distance, she looked at my direction and smiled. I smiled back. But there was something about her face. Something out of order. Something very odd. When I was a kid, I remember my little sister having these stuffed toy dolls with faces just painted on them. It was like that with Linda. It was almost like her face was just painted on, and that there was nothing underneath those lines. It was subtle, but under the sun, it was almost uncanny. And her smile, something about her smile that told me she knew I saw her the other night. It was terrifying. I left to go see my mom over brunch and told her about the whole Linda situation. My mom jokingly told me about an urban legend back in her province of an aswang that steals people's faces. This creature was said to know when someone was about to die and would steal their faces to use in committing terrifying acts. Using charcoal, the creature would then doodle a new face on. I laughed at the idea and forgot about the entire thing. Everything went back to normal after that. Linda and I had exchanged a few words through the next few months. One afternoon, she asked me if her record player was too loud, and I said no. She even gave me an old pocket watch with a mirror on the other side of it. A pocket mirror and watch, she told me. It was supposed to be her husband's, as she was trying to get rid of some of his things, but that was all. She went back to being distant and I went on with life. It was in December on that same year when I saw what I would describe as the scariest thing I've ever seen in my adult life. It was about 1 a.m. on a work week, and I was just getting home from a tiring day when I felt it again. That eerie feeling of being watched. Her house was blacked out again, and suddenly all those odd things about Linda started to fill my mind again. I froze in place. She was there, or it was there. I could make out the shape of her body on the porch. She was standing this time. Her hair was down, moving in the wind. It was starting to rain, and I was starting to get cold and shivering. I tried to find the courage to shine my phone's flashlight in her direction, but I was too scared of what it may uncover. Then I heard this very soft cry, a cry that you may hear from someone covering their mouth. I jumped and shined my flashlight in her direction. There was Linda, or what was once Linda, facing me. She wore a night sweater of some sort. She was very thin, and hair messed up from the wind. I screamed. Whatever it was standing in front of me wasn't Linda. She had no face. What was once the face of the neighbor I knew was gone. It was as if someone had taken it off. It was just pale white skin as a face. I could hear this soft cry again as she tried to talk with no mouth. She started to lift one of her hands, as if gesturing me to come over. I almost fainted. I never thought I could start my motorcycle as fast as I did, but I sped out of there and into the rainy night towards my mom's house. I never told anyone about what happened that night, and I managed to move out of the apartment the next week. To hell with my security deposit. I also never saw Linda again. I tried my best to bury that memory for so long. All of this happened about 20 years ago, and I never told anyone until now. I never really did find out what exactly happened to Linda, my old neighbor, but I sometimes asked around. Some say she passed away the following year. Some say she moved to live with her brother but left all her things behind, even her record player. It was like she just disappeared. But all this time, I kept the pocket mirror watch she gave me. I sometimes look at myself in that small mirror and think about why my face sometimes looks like it's just painted on. Story 3. My grandma just passed away, and I found her old journals. My grandma passed away last month. I inherited her home. It's been in the family for years, but my parents have their own home a bit further away now. So after my Grammy passed, it was all left to me. My sister and I were going through her belongings the other day, and we discovered a small wooden chest hidden in the attic. It was old, covered in dust, and had a rusty lock that had long since ceased to function. Inside, we found stacks of leather-bound journals, each meticulously dated and filled with my grandmother's elegant handwriting. The journals spanned decades, from 1960 to the turn of the century. Grandma was always a storyteller, weaving tales of our family's deep roots in the remote corners of Appalachia, but she never mentioned these journals. As I started reading, the stories unfolded with an eerie familiarity, painting a chilling picture of our family's history. With each entry, the sense of foreboding grew stronger, and I realized these weren't just stories, they were warnings. And now, the past seems to be clawing its way into my present. Journal entry, August 15, 1960. We've settled in Abingdon, a remote, isolated part of Appalachia. The land here feels ancient, steeped in untold stories and whispers of the past. The locals are a superstitious lot, with warnings about the woods that surround our new home. They say never to whistle after dark, as it invites the attention of things best left undisturbed. Last night, as the sun set behind the mountains, I felt a strange heaviness in the air, almost as if the mountains themselves were watching us. The wind carried strange, faint whispers that seemed to beckon me into the forest. I wonder if moving here was a mistake. Journal entry, October 2nd, 1961. Something strange happened tonight. As dusk fell, I heard a distant, haunting whistle from the direction of the woods. It sent a shiver down my spine, and I hurried inside, bolting the door behind me. Curiosity got the better of me, and I peeked through the window. At the edge of the forest, I saw a figure. At first, it looked like a man, but its limbs were unnaturally long, its eyes glowing with an eerie light. It stood there, motionless, for what felt like hours, before vanishing into the shadows. I didn't sleep at all that night, haunted by the image of those glowing eyes. Later, as the night grew deeper, the sounds of the forest became unnaturally silent, and I heard the creak of the floorboards outside my bedroom door. I held my breath, straining to hear any movement, but there was nothing. The air grew colder, and a sense of dread seeped into my bones. I knew something was out there, something that didn't belong. Journal entry, November 13th, 1965. The air in Abingdon has grown thick with fear. People have been disappearing without a trace. Last night, I was jolted awake by the sound of someone whistling outside my window. My heart raced as I peeked through the curtains. There, under the pale moonlight, stood a tall figure. Its eyes were like twin flames burning into my soul. It raised a hand and beckoned, its long fingers curling in a gesture that chilled me to the bone. I stayed awake until the first light of dawn, too terrified to move or make a sound. As the hours dragged on, I heard the sound of soft footsteps circling the house. The floorboards creaked, and the walls seemed to groan under the weight of an unseen presence. I could feel it watching me, a cold, malevolent gaze that pierced through the walls. When dawn finally broke, the oppressive feeling lifted, but the terror lingered. Journal entry, February 9th, 1970. Uncle Bill is gone. He left the house in the dead of night, muttering that he heard Ma's voice calling to him from the woods. We tried to stop him, but he was convinced it was her, despite Ma being dead for 5 years. The search party found his hat the next day, torn and bloodied, but there was no sign of Uncle Bill. The locals whisper about the things that mimic human voices to lure their prey. I can't shake the feeling that something malevolent is watching us, waiting for the right moment to strike. The night he disappeared, the air was thick with fog, and the trees seemed to close in around the house. Shadows danced at the edge of the forest, and I heard faint whispers carried on the wind. They sounded like Ma, but distorted, wrong. As the fog crept closer, the whispers grew louder, and I could feel a presence pressing in on all sides. When Uncle Bill stepped into the mist, it swallowed him whole, and the whispers stopped. Journal entry, September 21st, 1980. I found strange tracks behind the house today. They looked like hoof prints, but far larger and deeper than any animal native to these parts. The old-timers say it's the devil himself, roaming the hills and looking for souls to claim. They speak of an ancient curse, a pact made by our ancestors with dark forces to protect the land. I used to think these were just old wives' tales, but now I'm not so sure. The air is thick with a sense of foreboding, and I can't shake the feeling that something is watching us from the shadows. As I followed the tracks, I noticed the forest growing unnaturally silent. The usual sounds of wildlife were absent, replaced by a heavy, oppressive stillness. The tracks led to a clearing where the ground was scorched, as if burned by an intense heat. In the center of the clearing, I saw a figure, tall and gaunt, with eyes that glowed like embers. It turned its gaze towards me, and I felt a wave of dread wash over me. I fled back to the house, but I could feel its presence following me, a dark shadow that clung to my every step. Journal entry, May 12th, 1995. I've seen it with my own eyes, the creature, whatever it is. I was out checking the traps when I felt an overwhelming sense of dread, as if I was being watched. I turned and saw a creature emerging from the woods. It shifted forms, part human, part beast, its eyes burning with an unnatural light. It let out a low growl, a sound that seemed to vibrate through my very bones. I ran, stumbling and tripping in my haste, but I never looked back. Even now, I can feel its eyes on me, a malevolent presence that haunts my every step. The night after my encounter, I heard scratching at my window. I dared not look, but the sound was persistent, a slow, deliberate scraping that set my nerves on edge. I covered my ears, but the noise only grew louder, more insistent. Finally, I mustered the courage to peek through the curtains. There it was, the skinwalker, its face pressed against the glass, eyes glowing with an otherworldly hunger. I screamed, and it vanished, but I knew it would be back. Journal entry, December 31st, 1999. Tonight, there's an electricity in the air, as if something monumental is about to happen. The wind carries strange whispers, and I hear the faintest, most unsettling sound of whistling. They say the new millennium will bring change, but I fear it's bringing something else, something ancient, something hungry. As midnight approaches, the feeling of dread grows stronger. The shadows seem to move on their own, and I swear I saw a pair of glowing eyes staring at me from the edge of the forest. I can't shake the feeling that the past is catching up with us, and whatever it is, it's coming for me. As the clock struck midnight, the house was plunged into darkness. The wind howled, and the walls groaned as if under immense pressure. I heard footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving through the house. The air grew colder, and I could see my breath in the dim light. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and the shadows seemed to writhe and twist. I felt a cold hand on my shoulder, and I turned to see a face, pale and gaunt, with eyes that glowed like coals. It whispered my name, and I felt my blood run cold. And that was the end of the entries. As I close the last journal, a faint whistle drifts through the air, sending a chill down my spine. My hands tremble as I lock the doors and draw the curtains. The tales of Abingdon aren't just stories. They're a legacy of fear and darkness passed down through the generations. I realize now that by reading these journals, I've awakened something that should have remained buried. For the longest time I believed in this, but only since reading the journals have these instances started happening firsthand to me. The nights are long and sleepless. I hear that haunting whistle every night, growing closer with each passing hour. Shadows dance just beyond the tree line, and the air is thick with the weight of untold secrets. I know I have to leave this place, but deep down, I fear that some things you can't run from. The past has a way of catching up, especially in Abingdon. I love this family home, but I'm afraid I can't stay here much longer. If you liked the video, please consider subscribing and follow for more real-life horror stories. Thank you.